and also to start on time and to end on time. Thank you all for joining the meeting. I wanted to put some names and faces together for purposes of our first meeting before we meet with the board, and so we can all get acquainted. I am really impressed with uh, the body of this committee. You all have been Brian accepting because he's clearly on the young side, but everybody else has had looks like decades of experience living and working in the community. And that's not to diminish your role, Brian. As I mentioned to you before, it was just us on the phone. I'm delighted that a young, recent law graduate and volunteer is joined this committee. We welcome you, and it's great to have your input here. Um, I, in advance of the meeting, am not entirely. I confess to not being entirely sure what the impetus was for examining the code of ethics, or what the board seeks to obtain as the output of the committee, whether it is seeking structural changes, whether the trustees want the ethics committee powers to be expanded, to be contracted. I have read the Mamaroneck Code of Ethics. As a lawyer, I see a lot of, looks like maybe perhaps Michael is joining us by phone. I see a lot.
I am. I apologize.
Oh, great, Michael! It's great to have you join us.
I apologize for being late. I had difficulty getting in.
No worries. We've only just started, and I'm not repeating myself by merely saying that, or too much by saying that I'm looking forward to hearing what the trustees wish to see as the output of this committee, whether it is they believe that the ethics committee or the code of ethics needs to be expanded, whether it needs to be contracted, whether they believe the ethics committee is restricted in any way. I have looked at the current code of ethics, and merely as a lawyer with some years of practice, I see everything from typographical errors to seeming inconsistencies. But that doesn't answer my question as to whether there are structural aspects of the code that require attention. I've also scanned the model code from the New York State Comptroller's Office, but I haven't yet conformed it to how the village code tracks it. And by the way, before I go on, is there anybody who can serve as the secretary, at least for this meeting?
Well,
thank you, Brian.
I'm at an apartment, so it's loud.
That's fine. I mentioned earlier that in anticipation of what the committee's work might be, I have reached out to people I know who are professionally involved in this area, specifically the Center for the Advancement of Public Integrity at Columbia University. I've also been in contact with Professor Mark Davies from Fordham University, who wrote a book on this subject. I've ordered the book. Mark believes that it's got all sorts of great content for us. When I get it, I'll make that part of the resource for the committee. And I'm also aware that there are other town and village codes of ethics that are considered to be good models for us to look at. But at this point, I would just like to kind of throw it open to you all, and if there's any input you have. And again, I don't think we're not going to transact much business at this meeting. I think we ought to have the meeting with the village first. But I'd be very interested in hearing your views as to the genesis for this committee and what you anticipate as to the expectations for the work that we do.
I think, sorry, I guess I'll go first. I think we all know like the origination of the committee, like the litigation involving the planning board member. But I also think, and I had a question because in the ethics code, it says, I think in like section 2110, I want to say, part 9, it says the Board of Ethics will make annual reports and recommendations to the code. So my question is, why aren't the Board of Ethics just doing this themselves? And my other question is like, what has been done in the past in terms of like annual recommendation that the Board of Ethics is supposed to make according to the ethics code?
Yeah, I certainly don't know the answer to those questions. I am aware of the issue involving the planning board member, and I read Tom Murphy's decision, and I believe that is certainly related to the reason for why we are meeting, but I assume there was some consensus that there should be some independent look at the code and the structure of the committee.
All right, thank you.
Are there any other views as to that or any comments on that?
No, the only thing that I will add, and I agreed with your initial assessment of typos and so on. As part of the budget committee, we looked at the village procurement policy, and so much of the language was vague that it could be interpreted however you want. So I think that's one of the things we need to look at, is just to tighten up language.
Right. That's a very good point, and thank you for that. What I will do once we're underway is I have a marked up copy of the code where I just went through it line by line and picked out questions and comments, and I will endeavor to circulate that, assuming this is part of our responsibility, and invite your comments and suggestions. Again, I'm eager to hear what the trustees view as our work as well.
Well, I was on the board when we actually passed this ethics law, and there was some discussion about the vagueness and ambiguity in some of the laws or some of the code. And the idea being that the ethics board would essentially be an educational board and help inform volunteers and village employees on essentially, the best practices. And I don't think that ever really evolved. That was sort of the original intention behind, we realized that there was that ambiguity existed, and our hope was that the ethics board would through their annual reports gradually redefine or gradually pinpoint issues that they saw. And to my understanding, the annual reporting was either not done or was minimally done, and the education aspect was really not completed.
Right.
So
I think the other thing we need to keep in mind, and this is probably because I've come from an investment banking background with a firm that had $1 gazillion billion in fines globally. so much of behavior can be viewed as in line with the code of ethics, but it's perception. And it's how the public perceives what someone is doing, whether there's really something wrong or not. And I think we need to make sure somehow we cover that.
But I understand what you're saying, and I completely agree. But unfortunately, when we were evaluating the law the first go around years ago, that was exactly the problem that our attorney pointed out to us, and that you can't legislate perception.
Correct.
You can legislate, you can legislate the act, but you can't legislate somebody's perception. The community-wide perception, you can't let it, as
No,
much as we would like to say, you don't want the appearance of any conflict of interest. There's really the legal, that's a legal ambiguity that just is, that is troublesome for the village to enforce.
Yep. And I agree with you, John, but I think that's kind of linked with ensuring that the language is tight and not ambiguous.
Right. And I, to sort of give a little background on the history, when I was first elected as a trustee many years ago, the disclosure form that I had to fill out, I don't even think it was 1 page. I think it was a paragraph. It was embarrassingly slim. And that was sort of the genesis of the idea of revising the ethics law, was that there seemed to be, I wouldn't say, there was the appearance of self-dealing happening in the village. And it was an effort to try and make it more difficult or to get rid of that appearance. And the person who helped me, or one of the people that helped me, was an attorney from the city who had, volunteered on many committees, and frankly felt that even our law, our disclosure form, was woefully inadequate. Even the new one, woefully inadequate. And, he said, when I volunteer or do work in the city, I have like a 5 or 6 page disclosure form that I have to go through. It has to enumerate pretty much everything. And that's why this was viewed as the disclosure form and the ethics law were viewed as essentially a compromise between that perspective and the original perspective of being almost non-existent. So, I think the idea that we're having this conversation is a wonderful thing, because I think it represents, a growth in the awareness that the ethics law, has to be, the growth in the awareness both with the employees in the village and also the volunteers, that the ethics law is, something to be used, or that we have to be aware of, I think is key. Because I think 15, 20 years ago in the village of Amerenik, I don't even think people realized they had ever been presented with a copy of the ethics law and signed any disclosure forms.
Right, but to
'cause it was-
Brian's point, what is it that the ethics committee is doing in terms of staying on top of this? So I'd say that's probably one of the things that needs to be questioned probably a little more strongly than Brian raised. Is the committee doing its job?
Which raises the question, is the committee reactive or should the committee be proactive?
Correct.
Right.
Okay. I would, any other comments or
No, I
questions?
just wanted to say, one thing, and I agree with John along that line, and I've gone through the ethics laws a couple times, maybe not as in depth as some of you, but I want to look and just say, how do we get this out so that every volunteer and every employee is aware of it, right? And how often is that done? And what is the way to do that? But right now, I would question, how many people, employees in the village know the ethics law and the ins and outs of it, and how do we break this down into a sheet or something that they can use and be aware of, and we give it to them once a year or twice a year in some format.
Well, maybe one
I
of
can
the,
say as a volunteer, I've never gotten it, not once.
I
Right
haven't,
now, I've had some positions where I was responsible, for purchasing and spending money, and other positions where, I had varying levels of responsibility. I've never gotten it once, so I think that's something we got to look at.
and maybe that's something we recommend, that just like we're getting these sporadic emails, we got one this morning on conflict of interest training, that there be an annual course.
Well,
Mike, just to
yeah.
answer your question, sorry, John. There are only certain positions and certain committees that are obligated to complete the disclosure form. It's not for every committee. And that is also part of the ethics code.
Okay, but separate from the disclosure, should village volunteers and employees all adhere to the ethics code? And,
Yes.
I would say yes, right? And then are they aware of that even though they're not filling out this, that, they're employees of the village or they're volunteers, they've got to adhere to this. And I think we've got to get that message out. I think that would be important.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's a two-step process. Everybody gets a copy of the ethics code, whatever the ethics code may be, and has to essentially sign that they've read it. And then the disclosure form goes to the people that have purchasing authority or decision-making authority within the village, and they have to fill that out as well. I mean, whatever the disclosure, and again, whatever the disclosure form may be, because I do think you're right, Mike, that there probably are people who work for the village who, who are I would say unaware.
Sally, can you share the current disclosure form with us?
I can share the form, I could share the list. I could also share, at the beginning of the year, we do get the code and we have to acknowledge that we received the code and read it. I could share that with you.
Is that for every employee, or is that for just limited?
John, I believe it's for every employee and
Okay.
every volunteer member. We have just gone on to a digital document signing system.
Mhm.
And I believe that will be on January 1, that will be part of that digital system, that it goes out to everyone, all volunteers, all employees, that you've received the ethics code and you've read it.
Okay.
And have,
Ellen, you froze.
system won't let you sign until you've at least gone through the document.
That I don't know. There's something that our HR department is doing,
No, I do know that, Sally.
that it does not, or it does.
You can
It
set it up.
stops you from signing if you haven't gone through the document. I was having technical issues, so I was just clicking all over. And that unfortunately was one of the places I clicked, and it like, oh, you can't do this yet. So it does stop you.
Good.
Okay. Any other comments or questions at this point? We have our meeting, I believe, scheduled for Monday at 7:30. I think we're first on the agenda. And I encourage you all to be interactive, not shy, and to let's find out. Yes.
I'm not sure. We probably need to confirm it because there are too many.
Ellen, you froze again, but you're actually attending the work session and you are on for 6:30.
6:30.
At the
Yeah.
work session.
Right.
Okay,
And I will send you all panelist invites like I did for this meeting.
excellent.
One other thing before we go, I mean, as we sit here on this meeting via Zoom, I think the delivery of sort of the educational format of whatever gets developed or whatever we settle on or whatever the Board of Trustees settles on, in fact, we can do that now via Zoom and electronically. And so residents, volunteers, and employees can actually get, their annual brush up on the ethics law via a digital form, maybe,
Yeah.
and it becomes easier to track through that system that Sally has said that the village is now rolling out, so we can know who's participated in the ethics, quote unquote review or their annual ethics brush up course. So that way, we can, it's more easily documented.
I agree, John. It's too simple. I would venture twice a year. One is a 5-minute email. One is a 20 or 30-minute review that they could just sign and certify that they completed. I think at the end of this, I can't imagine that we would go through this and not recommend something along those lines. And twice a year might seem like a lot, but I don't think that 5 minutes is that much of anyone's time to say this had to be reviewed so that people are constantly aware of the village's expectations for their ethical behavior.
Were you saying, Michael, 120 to 30-minute review and then a 5-minute refresher? Is that what you were suggesting?
Yeah, I think something as simple as an email midway through the year, right? Whatever the ethics year would be, midway through, bullet point information, whatever has developed during the course of the last 6 months or year, or if it's just a reminder of everybody's responsibilities according to the ethics code that got emailed and somebody has to reply back that they've received it and reviewed it. And that once a year, similar to, the sexual harassment and Title VII violations that, is ongoing now and is a good thing. And I think that we could follow that model, but do it electronically, right? And potentially, if we wanted to create 2 tiers or recommend 2 tiers, there might be other employees who needed to do this in person, maybe every other year. But I don't see the harm in sending something out twice a year to everyone and having them look at it, at least for the employees that could do it on duty. For the volunteers, we could, minimize it down so it could be done online, 20, 30 minutes.
Okay, that's something we should note for our discussions during the course of our work and as a possible finding for whatever report we issue. Okay. Any other comments or questions for now? If not, then thank you all very, very much for attending. It was great to meet you. Look forward to working with you. And we'll reconvene at 6:30 on Monday with our meeting with the board. Sally, thank you so much for your help on this.
Thank you.
Pleasure, guys.
Right.
See you Monday.
Right.
Take
Bye.
care. Bye-bye.
Bye.